The sun was setting behind the hills, painting the sky with soft shades of orange and gold. Mary stood outside her small farmhouse, folding her arms as the evening breeze swept across the dry fields. Life had never been easy for her, but she had learned to endure hardships with quiet strength. Since her parents passed away, she had been running the farm alone, taking care of the animals and the land with whatever little resources she had left. Her farm was not big, only a few acres of soil that struggled to stay fertile. The barn was old, its roof patched with tin, and the fences leaned as if tired of standing. But to Mary, it was home, and she guarded it with all her heart. That evening, as she prepared to gather the last of the chickens into their coop, she noticed something unusual. The sound of hooves echoed faintly from the road that led past her farm. She turned her head and squinted. A lone horse was approaching slowly, its rider slumped forward, barely holding onto the reins. Mary's heart skipped. She hurried closer to the fence. The rider was a man, his clothes dusty, his hat tilted low over his face. As the horse reached her yard, the man swayed and almost fell. Mary rushed forward, catching his arm before he could collapse to the ground. "Sir, are you all right?" she asked in a worried voice. The man lifted his head slightly. His face was pale, and his eyes heavy with exhaustion. A thin line of blood ran down his arm, staining his sleeve. I need a place to rest," he murmured weakly. Mary felt a surge of pity. He was clearly wounded, and his horse looked as tired as he did. She quickly guided him down from the saddle, steadying his weak steps. "Come, you can't stay out here. Let me take you to the barn." The man nodded faintly, too weak to protest. Mary led him into the barn and helped him sit on a pile of hay. She could see the cut on his arm more clearly now. It wasn't deep, but it had bled enough to make him weak. His clothes told her he was a cowboy, someone who spent his days riding long miles under the sun. Mary fetched a bucket of water and a clean cloth. Carefully, she washed the wound and tied a strip of old cloth around it. The cowboy barely spoke, but his eyes followed her every move, showing both gratitude and pain. "You should rest here tonight," Mary said gently. "It's not much, but the barn is dry and safe. I'll bring you some food." The man tried to speak, but his voice cracked. "Thank you, miss." Mary gave him a small smile and hurried back to the house. She returned with bread, a little cheese, and a jar of water. As he ate slowly, she noticed how tired he looked, as if life had worn him down. There was something lonely in his eyes, a weight she could not yet understand. After finishing his meal, the cowboy leaned back against the hay and sighed deeply. "You've been kind to me, though you don't even know my name." Mary folded her hands and said softly, "Names can wait. Rest first." The man gave a faint smile. "My name's John." Mary nodded. "I'm Mary." That night, as the crickets chirped and the wind rustled through the trees, John slept in the barn, his horse resting nearby. Mary checked on him twice before she went to bed, making sure he was breathing steadily. She didn't know who he really was, or why he had come this way wounded and weary, but something inside her told her that this meeting was not by chance. The next morning, the rooster crowed, and Mary rose early as usual. She stepped outside and looked toward the barn. A strange feeling of curiosity filled her chest. Who was this cowboy who had appeared on her farm? And why had he been alone, riding in such a broken state? She could not guess then that his presence would change her life forever. She could not imagine that a simple act of kindness, letting him sleep in her barn, would open a door to a future she had never dared to dream. But the story of Mary and the wounded cowboy was only beginning. The morning sun spread soft light over the farm, warming the dew-covered grass. Mary tied her apron as she stepped out with a basket of feed for the chickens. She had almost forgotten, for a brief moment, that a stranger had spent the night in her barn. But as soon as she saw the door slightly ajar, memory rushed back. Mary walked quietly inside. John, the wounded cowboy, was awake. He was sitting on the haystack, his hat resting on his knee. His arm was still bandaged with the cloth Mary had tied the night before. He looked weary, but his eyes were calmer than yesterday. "You didn't have to check on me again," he said softly when he noticed her. Mary shook her head. "I couldn't just leave you like that. You were hurt, and I couldn't ignore it." John gave a faint smile, though it carried sadness. "It's been a long time since someone cared enough to stop for me." Mary studied him closely. His clothes were worn, his boots dusty, and his face marked with lines of hardship. He looked like a man who had traveled far, carrying stories he never told. "Do you want some breakfast?" she asked, changing the subject. "That would be mighty kind," John replied. Mary returned to the house and came back with warm bread, fresh milk, and a boiled egg. John thanked her, his manners gentle, and ate slowly. Each bite seemed to give him a little more strength. "You live here alone?" John asked after a while. "Yes," Mary said. "This farm belonged to my parents. They passed away a few years ago. I try my best to keep it running, but it isn't easy." John looked at the barn walls, the old tools stacked in the corner, and the tired horse chewing hay. He could see the signs of struggle. "You're strong to manage all this by yourself," he said. Mary smiled faintly. "I've learned to manage, but some days it feels like the land is slipping away from me." John was silent for a moment. His eyes grew distant, as though he was remembering something heavy. "I know that feeling," he finally said. "I had land once, more than I knew what to do with. But sometimes land doesn't feel like a blessing. Sometimes it feels like a burden." Mary tilted her head. "Then why did you keep it?" John hesitated. He did not answer directly, but his silence said enough. Mary did not press him. She had learned that some people carried wounds deeper than any cut, and not all of them could be healed with questions. After breakfast, Mary went back to her chores. She milked the cow, gathered eggs, and mended a broken section of the fence. John watched her from the barn door for a while. Finally, he stepped outside, though his arm was still sore. "Let me help," he offered. "You should be resting," Mary said quickly. "I've rested enough. Besides, I can't just sit and watch you do everything alone," John replied firmly. Mary hesitated, then nodded. She handed him a hammer, and together they worked on fixing the fence. Though John's movements were slower, his hands were steady and skilled. The way he handled the wood and nails showed that he had known hard work all his life. As they worked side by side, Mary noticed something in him. Beneath his tired face and worn clothes, there was a quiet dignity, the kind that only came from years of living close to the land. By noon, the fence was repaired. Mary wiped sweat from her brow and looked at him with a small smile. "Not bad for someone who was too weak to stand last night." John chuckled softly. "I guess a night in your barn did me some good." The sound of his laugh surprised Mary. It was the first time she had heard it, and it carried warmth she hadn't expected. For a moment, the heavy air between them lifted, replaced by something lighter. Later that day, Mary prepared stew for lunch. As they sat outside under the shade of the old oak tree, John spoke again. "Mary, I owe you more than I can say. You didn't have to help me, but you did. Not many people would have done that for a stranger." Mary looked at him calmly. "Sometimes people just need kindness. That's all." John's gaze lingered on her, thoughtful and serious. "Kindness like yours, it can change a man's heart." Mary felt her cheeks warm, but she quickly lowered her eyes to her bowl of stew. She wasn't used to such words, especially from someone she had only just met. As the day turned to evening, John grew quiet again, staring out at the horizon. Mary sensed that he was carrying secrets, something too heavy for words. Yet she also felt that their paths had crossed for a reason. Neither of them knew yet how deeply their lives would become connected. But in that simple day, sharing work, food, and silence, a bond had begun to form. A bond that would soon lead to choices neither of them expected. The days passed quietly on Mary's farm. John stayed in the barn, resting his injured arm and helping with small chores whenever he could. At first, Mary thought he might leave as soon as his strength returned, but something about him told her he was not in a hurry to ride away. Mary had grown used to being alone. For years, silence had been her only companion, the sound of the wind through the fields, the lowing of cows, the cluck of hens. But now, with John's steady presence, that silence was broken. At breakfast, there was conversation. At work, there was the comfort of another set of hands. And in the evenings, as the sun dipped low, there was someone to share a quiet moment with. One morning, Mary found John near the barn, brushing down his horse. His movements were slow but careful, showing tenderness toward the animal. She walked over, carrying a basket of feed for the chickens. "That horse of yours seems loyal," she remarked. John nodded, running the brush along the horse's neck. "He's been with me through storms, dust, and long roads. A man can lose a lot in life, but if his horse stays true, he isn't completely alone." Mary looked at him closely. "Have you lost much, John?" He paused, his hand stopping mid-stroke. For a moment, he seemed like he might not answer. Then, in a low voice, he said, "More than I care to speak of." Mary respected his silence. She didn't ask further, though her heart ached with curiosity. She had the sense that whatever his story was, it carried both sorrow and weight. Later that day, they worked together in the vegetable garden. Mary showed John how she planted seeds in neat rows, covering them gently with soil. He listened carefully, though his rough hands were more used to holding reins and rope than tending plants. "You have patience," John said as he watched her. "You treat the land like it's alive." "It is alive," Mary replied simply. "If you take care of it, it gives back. But if you forget it, it withers." John's eyes softened as he looked at her. "That's true for people, too." The words lingered in Mary's heart, though he said them casually. She wondered what kind of care John had been missing in his life, and why he had come to her doorstep in such a broken state. That evening, as they sat outside by the porch, John finally spoke more openly. "Mary, I've been traveling for months now. I left behind a ranch, a big one. It was more land than any man could handle alone. 2,000 acres, spread wide with cattle and hills." Mary's eyes widened. 2,000 acres? That's more land than the whole valley. John nodded slowly. "It was my family's land. But after my brother passed, and the years of drought, I couldn't keep it the same. I rode away, trying to find peace. But the truth is, I never found it. Mary listened quietly. His voice carried no pride, only weariness. It was clear that the land he spoke of had not been a gift to him but a heavy load. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked softly. "Because you remind me of something I lost," John said. "You work hard, you care for the little you have, and you don't give up. I see strength in you that I couldn't find in myself anymore." Mary lowered her gaze, her cheeks warming. She had never thought of herself as strong, only as someone who had no choice but to keep going. That night, Mary couldn't sleep. She thought of John's words, his past, and the land he spoke of. She imagined wide fields, cattle grazing, hills stretching as far as the eye could see. It was a world far beyond her small struggling farm, and yet John spoke of it with a kind of sadness, as though it meant nothing to him anymore. The next morning, John surprised her again. After breakfast, he walked with her to the barn and said, "Mary, I've decided something. I can't hold on to that land anymore. It's not for me. But maybe it was meant for someone else." Mary looked at him in confusion. "What do you mean?" John met her eyes, steady and sincere. You should have it." Her breath caught. "Me? But why?" "I've done nothing, you did everything," John interrupted gently. "You gave me a place to rest when I was nothing but a stranger. You healed me when I had no one. You gave me kindness without asking for anything back. Mary, that land needs someone like you. Someone who will care for it, not just own it." Mary stood frozen, her heart pounding. The idea was too big, too impossible. She shook her head. "John, I can't accept that. 2,000 acres. That's not something you just give away." But John only smiled faintly, as though the decision had already been made in his heart. Mary didn't know what to say, but deep inside, she felt the beginning of something she couldn't name. It was not just about land. It was about trust, about two souls who had met by chance but were slowly changing each other's lives. And though she tried to push the thought aside, one question stayed with her: what would it mean if John truly gave her his land? The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth after a light night rain. Mary stood near the well, filling a bucket with water, but her mind was far from her chores. John's words from the day before echoed inside her like a bell that refused to stop ringing. 2,000 acres, for her? The thought was too heavy, too impossible. When she turned, John was already awake, standing near the barn with his horse tied beside him. He looked stronger now, though his arm was still bound with cloth. His eyes followed her with quiet purpose, as if he had been waiting for this moment. "Mary," he began, his voice steady. "I wasn't speaking out of weakness yesterday. I meant every word. That land, it doesn't belong to me anymore. It belongs to someone who can breathe life into it. Someone like you." Mary set the bucket down quickly, water sloshing over the rim. "John, stop. You don't even know me well enough. I've done nothing to deserve such a gift." John stepped closer, his boots pressing against the soft ground. "It isn't about deserving. It's about what's right. I've carried that land like a weight, but it never gave me peace. When I came here, when you opened your barn without question, I realized peace doesn't come from what a man owns. It comes from what he gives." Mary stared at him, torn between disbelief and fear. "But 2,000 acres, that's more than I could ever manage. I can barely keep this little farm alive." John gave her a thoughtful look. "Maybe so. But you have something I lost: hope. You don't quit, even when the land resists you. That's what makes the difference. Mary's heart pounded. She turned away, brushing her hands nervously against her apron. I can't even imagine it, John. It's too much. And people will talk. They'll say I tricked you, or that you were not in your right mind. John's lips curved faintly, though there was no humor in his eyes. Let them talk. I know my mind. And I know my choice. The conversation left Mary unsettled all day. She worked in the field, pulling weeds and watering the small patches of corn that had begun to sprout, but her thoughts kept circling back. She imagined wide open hills, streams running through grass, cattle grazing under the sun. A life so different from the one she had known. But with each thought came another, why me? That evening, John sat with her on the porch, the two of them watching the sky melt into shades of pink and purple. Silence stretched between them, comfortable yet heavy with unspoken words. Finally, John broke it. Tomorrow, he said slowly, I'll ride into town. I'll speak with the man who keeps the papers for my land. It'll be signed in your name before another week passes. Mary's head snapped toward him. John, no. Please, don't do this so quickly. You need time. You need to think clearly. I've thought longer than you know, John replied, his gaze fixed on the horizon. For years, I wondered what would become of that ranch. I tried selling parts of it. I tried letting others manage it. Nothing worked. I kept holding on, even when it broke me. But meeting you, Mary, showed me something new. Sometimes holding on is the mistake. Sometimes letting go is the gift. Mary's throat tightened. She didn't know what to say. The sincerity in his eyes, the quiet strength in his voice, it all left her shaken. That night, she lay awake in her small room, staring at the wooden ceiling. She thought of her parents, of the years of struggle she had endured alone, of the tears she had hidden when crops failed and debts grew. What would they say now if they knew that a stranger, a wounded cowboy, wanted to hand her a future larger than her dreams? The next morning, true to his word, John saddled his horse. Mary stood by the gate, her hands clenched around her apron. You don't have to do this, she said one last time. John adjusted the strap of his saddle and looked at her with calm certainty. I know. But I want to. With that, he tipped his hat, mounted his horse, and rode down the dusty road toward town. Mary watched him until he disappeared into the horizon, her heart torn between fear and hope. The farm felt unusually quiet without him. Every creak of the barn, every call of the chickens reminded her of his presence. She went about her chores, but her thoughts were with him, wondering what he was saying, what papers he was signing, and whether she truly wanted what he was offering. That evening, just as the sun dipped low, she saw John riding back. His posture was firm, his expression unreadable. He dismounted slowly, tied his horse, and walked toward her. It's done, he said simply. The papers are signed. The land is now in your name. Mary gasped, her knees weakening. John, you really did it? He nodded, his eyes calm but filled with something deeper relief. Yes. And for the first time in years, I feel free. Mary's world spun around her. She had not asked for this. She had not dreamed of it. Yet here it was, dropped into her life like a miracle she could barely hold. And as she stood there, trembling, she realized her life had changed forever. The papers sat on Mary's wooden table, their edges curling slightly in the warm air of the farmhouse. She had stared at them all morning, unable to believe that her name was written there in black ink. Owner of 2,000 acres. The words looked unreal, as though they belonged to someone else. John had left them there the night before, saying simply, "They're yours now. No one can take them from you." After that, he had gone to rest in the barn, leaving Mary with thoughts too heavy to carry. By sunrise, news had already started to spread in town. Mary knew it would. Nothing stayed secret for long. When John had signed the papers, he must have spoken to the clerk, and clerks always had quick tongues. She imagined how the townsfolk were whispering now about the poor farmer's daughter who suddenly owned more land than anyone in the county. That morning, Mary hitched her old wagon to her mule and made her way into town. She needed supplies, but she also wanted to see with her own eyes how people would react. The streets were busy as always, dust rising under the wheels of carts and the hooves of horses. Mary kept her chin steady, though her heart beat fast. She felt every glance that turned her way, every murmur that followed her steps. At the general store, Mrs. Parker, the shopkeeper's wife, greeted her with a smile that seemed too bright. "Well, Mary," she said loudly, so others could hear, "I hear you're quite the landowner now. 2,000 acres. My, what a blessing." Mary tried to return the smile. "It doesn't feel real," she admitted softly. Mrs. Parker leaned closer, lowering her voice though her eyes still sparkled with curiosity. "And that cowboy, what's his story? Folks are saying he just handed it all to you. Is it true?" Mary felt her cheeks warm. "He was hurt. I gave him shelter, that's all. The land was his decision, not mine." But Mrs. Parker only nodded knowingly, as though she understood more than Mary was willing to explain. "Well, dear, people will talk. But don't let their tongues trouble you. If the Lord put this gift in your hands, then it must have been meant for you." Mary bought her supplies quickly and left, her heart heavy. On the street, she heard voices whispering. Why her? She must have some secret hold over him. 2,000 acres, just like that. There's more to this story. Each word pricked at her like a thorn. By the time she returned to her wagon, she felt smaller than she had in years. Back at the farm, John was waiting. He had spent the morning repairing the barn door, and when he saw her troubled face, he set his tools aside. "Town wasn't kind, was it?" he asked gently. Mary shook her head, her hands tightening on the reins. "They think I tricked you. They think I don't deserve any of this." John's eyes softened, and he stepped closer. "Let them think what they want. The truth doesn't change because of gossip." Mary looked at him, her eyes filled with worry. "But how am I supposed to carry this, John? 2,000 acres, it's more than land. It's responsibility. People will expect things of me now. They'll watch me, judge me, wait for me to fail." John placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "Mary, you've been carrying burdens your whole life. You know what it means to work hard, to care for what's yours. This land won't break you, it will give you a chance to rise." Mary's chest tightened. She wanted to believe him, but fear still clung to her. "I don't even know where to begin." "Then begin the way you always have," John said firmly. "One day at a time. 1 acre at a time." That night, Mary stood at the edge of her farm, looking out at the fields that were now legally hers. The moonlight silvered the land, stretching far beyond what her eyes could see. It was beautiful, but also overwhelming. She whispered into the night, "Lord, give me strength for what's ahead." The following days were filled with both wonder and trial. Some neighbors came to offer congratulations, though their smiles did not always reach their eyes. Others came with offers, men wanting to buy pieces of the land, claiming they could help her manage it. Mary listened politely but turned them away. Something in her heart told her that John was right, she was meant to care for the land herself. John stayed by her side, helping where he could. His wound healed slowly, but his presence grew stronger each day. Together, they began to plan where fences might be built, where cattle might graze, how the wide fields could be planted with wheat. One evening, as they sat by the porch, Mary spoke softly. "John, why me? Out of all the people you could have given this land to, why choose me?" John looked at her with a calm steadiness. "Because you were the only one who opened your door without asking for anything in return. That kind of heart is rare. And land should belong to hands like yours." Mary felt tears prick her eyes, but she held them back. She wasn't sure yet if she was ready for the weight of what lay ahead. But she knew one thing with certainty: her life was no longer the same. And perhaps, with time, she would grow into the gift that had been placed in her care. The days on Mary's farm grew longer as summer stretched across the land. For the first time in years, Mary felt the weight of possibility pressing on her shoulders. 2,000 acres now lay in her name, and though the thought frightened her, it also lit a quiet fire inside her. Every morning, she woke before sunrise, tying her hair back and pulling on her worn boots. John was always near, his horse grazing by the barn, his hands ready to work despite the healing wound on his arm. He was no longer just a guest, he had become her partner in labor, a steady figure who shared both silence and effort. One morning, as the rooster crowed and the sky glowed pink, John pointed toward the far horizon. "Those hills out there," he said, "that's where the grass grows thick after the rains. Perfect for cattle." Mary followed his gaze, her breath catching at the vastness of what was now hers. "I've never even walked that far," she admitted. John smiled faintly. "Then it's time you do. The land won't feel real until you've set your feet on it." Later that day, they saddled his horse and an old mule from Mary's barn. The ride was slow but steady, the sun high above as they crossed streams and meadows. Mary's heart swelled as she saw the land with her own eyes: the rolling fields, the scattered trees, the soil rich and waiting. "This is all mine," she whispered, as though saying it too loudly might make it vanish. John nodded. "It's yours. And it's waiting for you to breathe life into it." The words stayed with her long after they returned home. That night, as she sat by the window with a lantern glowing beside her, Mary began to sketch simple plans on scraps of paper. She listed ideas: fencing, planting wheat, building a larger barn. The task seemed endless, but instead of fear, she felt determination rising. The next weeks were filled with work. John guided her through things she had never done before: how to test soil, how to mark land for grazing, how to mend strong fences. His knowledge was steady, shaped by years on ranches and open fields. Mary listened, learned, and grew braver each day. Still, challenges came quickly. The first came from the weather. A sudden storm swept across the valley, tearing shingles from her roof and flooding the lower fields. Mary stood in the rain, clutching her apron as water rushed around her boots, wondering if the land itself was testing her. But John was at her side, shouting above the storm. "Don't give in, Mary. Storms pass. Hold on, and tomorrow we'll rebuild." And they did. The next day, they worked from dawn until dark, fixing the roof, clearing debris, and guiding water away from the fields. Mary's hands blistered, her back ached, but she did not stop. For the first time, she felt the strength of not just surviving, but building. Another challenge came from men in town. A few rode out to her farm, offering money for sections of the land. One man leaned against his saddle with a sly smile and said, "You'll never manage this much alone, miss. Best to let someone like me take half of it off your hands." Mary's voice trembled at first, but she stood tall. "This land isn't for sale. Not today, not tomorrow." The men laughed as they rode away, but John placed a proud hand on her shoulder. "That's the spirit. They'll keep coming, but don't let them shake you. The land needs your voice to defend it." As weeks passed, Mary began to see changes in herself. She no longer felt like the girl who could barely hold on to her small farm. She was learning to lead, to plan, and to dream. In the evenings, when she and John sat by the porch watching the sky fade into stars, she sometimes wondered if she would have found this strength without him. One night, Mary spoke softly. "John, do you ever wish you'd kept the land for yourself?" He shook his head without hesitation. "No, I see it now. It was never meant for me. I was only keeping it safe until the right hands came along. And I believe those hands are yours." Mary felt her throat tighten. His trust in her was more than a gift, it was a responsibility she could not walk away from. The farmyard grew quieter as the crickets began their nightly song. Mary looked at the vast fields stretching into the darkness and whispered, almost to herself, "Then I won't let you down." John glanced at her, his eyes warm with something she could not name. "I know you won't." And though the road ahead was uncertain, Mary felt ready for the first time in her life. She was no longer simply surviving. She was building something that might last beyond her, something rooted in kindness, courage, and trust. The summer slowly gave way to autumn, and the wide land that once felt impossible to Mary now felt like a part of her. Every morning when she stepped outside, the fields greeted her with new purpose. The air carried the scent of tilled soil and ripening crops, and the fences she and John had built stood tall against the horizon. For the first time in years, Mary no longer felt like she was barely holding on. She felt steady, grounded, and stronger than she had ever imagined. But deep inside, she still wondered what the future would hold for her, for the land, and for John. One cool evening, as the sun set behind the hills, John leaned against the porch railing, watching the sky blaze with red and gold. Mary brought out 2 cups of warm tea and set one beside him. "You've changed this place," John said quietly, his eyes on the horizon. Mary shook her head with a gentle smile. "No. The place changed me." John looked at her then, his expression thoughtful. "You've done more than just survive, Mary. You've made the land breathe again. I can see it in the soil, in the way the animals graze, in the crops rising taller than before." Mary sipped her tea, her heart warming at his words. "I couldn't have done it without you." But John's eyes grew distant, and for a long moment he didn't answer. Finally, he set his cup down and said, "Mary, I've been thinking. The land belongs to you now, and you're ready to carry it. My road may be leading me somewhere else." Mary's hand froze midair. She turned to him quickly, her voice unsteady. "You're leaving?" John looked down at his hands, rough from years of work. "I never planned to stay long. I was just passing through when I came here, wounded and lost. You gave me shelter and healed me in more ways than one. But I can't tie you to me. This is your story now, not mine." Mary's chest tightened, a heaviness she hadn't expected filling her heart. She stared at him, her voice trembling. "John, this land may have my name, but it carries your mark too. Every fence post, every seed we planted, you've been here in all of it. How can you say it's not your story?" John's gaze met hers, and for the first time, she saw the deep battle inside him. "I've lived a life of wandering. Staying too long in one place never worked for me. But you belong here. You're rooted. I don't want to hold you back." Mary set her cup aside and stood. The words came before she could stop them. "You're not holding me back. You're holding me steady." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft chirping of crickets. John rose slowly, his tall frame outlined against the fading light. "Are you saying you want me to stay?" Mary's eyes glistened as she nodded. "Yes, John. This land is wide, but it doesn't feel whole without you. Maybe you were meant to wander until you found where you belonged. And maybe, it's here." For the first time in a long while, John's guarded expression softened into a true smile. He stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "Then if you'll have me, Mary, I'll stay." The days that followed carried a new kind of peace. The whispers in town grew quieter, replaced with respect as people began to see how the land was thriving under Mary's care. Fields stretched golden with wheat, cattle grazed on rich grass, and neighbors who once doubted now came to ask her advice. Through it all, John stood beside her not as a wanderer passing through, but as a man who had finally found his place. He mended fences, guided cattle, and taught Mary everything he knew about the land. And Mary, with her patience and hope, gave the land and John a chance to be whole again. One evening in late autumn, as the wind carried the scent of wood smoke and the stars lit up the sky, Mary walked to the far edge of the field. John followed her, and together they looked out over the vast land that stretched as far as the eye could see. "This," Mary whispered, her voice steady, "this is more than just land now. It's a beginning." John placed his hand gently over hers. "A beginning we'll share." Mary turned to him, her eyes filled with quiet gratitude. She had once thought she was destined to struggle alone, with nothing but a small farm to her name. But a wounded cowboy had ridden into her life, carrying a gift that was far greater than acres or fields. He had given her hope, trust, and the courage to dream again. And as they stood together beneath the wide, endless sky, Mary knew with certainty that her story and John's was only just beginning.